This June 14th, A Ricker Runs Through. It will premiere, marking the 85th episode of the series and the 4th episode of Season 9. Although Adult Swim has revealed very little about its story, the title itself may contain an important clue about where the plot is headed. In this video, we'll break down everything we know so far, the possible references behind the episode's name, and the theories that could hint at what we'll see in Rick and Morty's next adventure. The first thing that stands out is the episode's name itself. A Ricker Runs Through It. At first glance, it sounds unusual, but it's actually a play on the 1992 film A River Runs Through It, starring Brad Pitt. The writers simply replaced the word river with Ricker, turning Rick into the centerpiece of the reference in classic Rick and Morty fashion. The original film tells the story of two brothers whose lives are deeply connected through their shared passion for fly fishing, while the river symbolizes the passage of time, the choices they make, and the paths that ultimately drive them apart. It's a reflective story about family, destiny, and missed opportunities. Rick and Morty has a long history of using episode titles that reference famous movies, but those references often serve as clues to the episode's central theme as well. That's why it wouldn't be surprising if this adventure revolves around a journey, a river, a personal quest, or even the idea of Rick being forced down a path he cannot escape. It's also possible that the episode explores family relationships or the consequences of Rick's own decisions, using the river as a metaphor for the inevitable course of events. Of course, there's still no official synopsis confirming any of these ideas. However, considering the show's track record, it's unlikely that the title was chosen at random, and it probably carries a deeper meaning than it appears to at first glance. Thanks to the promotional sketches released alongside this season's episode titles, we can already see a scene that clearly parodies A River Runs Through It. The illustration shows Rick and Morty fishing together by a river, serving as a direct visual reference to the film that inspired the episode's name. However, one detail immediately stands out. Rick has the familiar stain around his mouth that usually suggests he's been drinking alcohol. His behavior seems to support that idea, because instead of taking the activity seriously, he uses the fish he just caught to annoy Morty, acting like the chaotic grandfather we've come to expect. All of this could suggest that the episode centers around a classic grandfather-grandson bonding experience, a trip that Rick probably has little interest in taking, but agrees to anyway, seemingly while under the influence of alcohol. The illustration also features an unknown man who appears to be dressed as a fishing guide or instructor, making it possible that the outing is part of an organized excursion, and that this mysterious character will play an important role in the story. The first preview features a conversation between Beth and Rick. Beth approaches her father, clearly confused, and asks how such a tiny liquor bottle could possibly hold so much alcohol. With the absurd logic that defines Rick's character, he casually explains that it's actually very simple. The bottle is a portal to an entire world filled with vodka, where tiny workers spend all their time keeping it endlessly stocked. After delivering his explanation, Rick ends the conversation by saying he's going to empty his bottle, an obvious way of admitting that he plans to keep drinking until he's completely wasted. The second preview then shifts to what appears to be a separate scene rather than a direct continuation of the first. This time, Rick emerges from one of his gun portals, but he's in far worse condition. He's completely drunk, still drinking, barely able to stand, struggling just to walk, and even ends up urinating on himself. He's in such terrible shape that he can hardly put a sentence together. Even so, he tries to access the system that controls his entire laboratory so he can activate its equipment, only to realize that he can't even remember the password. Frustration quickly takes over as he repeatedly enters different combinations, until he accidentally activates the laboratory's lockdown protocol instead of unlocking the system. With no idea how to fix the situation, Rick finally shouts for Morty. As soon as Morty arrives, the first thing he notices is the overwhelming smell of alcohol and urine. Seeing Rick in such a miserable state, Morty becomes genuinely concerned and even offers to make him breakfast or dinner, whatever he wants. Rick, however, interprets the offer as pity and proudly insists that he only had a few drinks, so he doesn't need anyone treating him differently. Finally, Rick loses his temper and starts yelling at the machine, complaining that it won't let him in. Morty immediately realizes that Rick himself is the reason the system won't respond, but Rick refuses to admit it. In a burst of anger, he punches the device, only to be met with a powerful electric shock that sends him crashing straight to the floor. And that's where the preview comes to an end. Now let's break down the preview and dive into some theories about the upcoming episode. The most interesting part isn't simply that Rick is completely drunk. It's that, for what feels like the first time, he seems to have lost control in a way that even his genius can't fix. For years, we've watched him solve every problem with an impossible invention or a backup plan he supposedly put in motion decades earlier. Here, however, the exact opposite happens. Rick is defeated by something as simple as a password and ultimately has to rely on Morty to get him out of an embarrassing situation. For the smartest man in the universe, that may be one of the most humiliating scenarios imaginable. From the very first moments of the preview, it's clear that alcohol isn't being used solely for comedic effect. Rick can barely stand, struggles to speak, constantly makes mistakes, and even displays small visual details that emphasize just how intoxicated he is. Everything suggests that the writers are pushing his drinking problem further than ever before. In previous seasons, his alcoholism felt like just another part of his personality, but here it appears to become the episode's central conflict. What's especially interesting is that this preview arrives after a series of episodes in which Rick seemed to have found a new direction in life. After defeating Rick Prime and finally leaving behind the obsession that defined so much of his existence, you'd expect him to find some peace. Instead, the opposite seems to have happened. Once the goal that gave his life meaning disappeared, Rick was left without a reason to keep moving forward. The enemy is no longer out there. It's inside him. That's why Season 9 can be interpreted as one continuous story about Rick's personal crisis. The previous episode showed him trying to escape his own identity by living as Ted, while this preview may be showing us the consequences of that failure. No matter how hard he tries to change his life, erase his memories, or distract himself with new adventures, he always ends up right back where he started. The season seems to be asking a fascinating question. What happens when someone finally achieves the goal they've spent their entire life chasing, only to discover they're still unhappy? Another striking detail is that Rick, the man who normally creates security systems that no one else can crack, is ultimately defeated by a password that he himself can't remember. The scene works as a joke, but it also serves as a powerful metaphor. The man capable of controlling the multiverse can't even control his own life. For years, Rick represented the idea that intelligence could solve any problem. But this episode seems to argue the exact opposite. Some emotional struggles simply can't be fixed with science or technology. Morty's role may also be far more important than it initially appears. Instead of simply being Rick's sidekick on another adventure, he almost takes on the role of a caretaker. He's the one forced to deal with a crisis created by Rick himself, completely reversing the traditional dynamic of the series. Some moments even bring to mind the backstory of evil Morty, where a Rick incapable of taking care of himself becomes entirely dependent on his grandson. That doesn't necessarily mean the story is heading in that direction, but it does show that the writers are well aware of the parallel. We also shouldn't overlook the episode's title, A Ricker Runs Through It, an obvious reference to a river runs through it. In the original film, the river symbolizes the passage of time and the different paths its characters choose in life. If Rick and Morty is drawing from that same inspiration, the river could represent the inevitable course of Rick's own life. A character who, no matter how hard he tries to change his destiny, always seems to end up in the same place. Even the promotional artwork shows Rick and Morty fishing together, as if this adventure is meant to become a meaningful bonding experience between grandfather and grandson. In the end, everything points to this episode being far more than a collection of scenes featuring a completely drunk Rick. Beneath the comedy may lie one of the deepest character studies the series has ever given its protagonist. After conquering the multiverse, defeating his greatest enemies, and proving himself to possess nearly limitless intelligence, perhaps the one challenge Rick never truly learned to overcome is facing himself. But now I want to hear your theories about the next episode. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll be reading them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.